Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
We're talking about India and China, as Vivek said, two Asian heavyweights at least, if not big powers. So my first question to you, and this is right now, of course, we're in the middle of the pandemic, and we're all talking also in the wake of the clashes in Ladakh between Indian and Chinese soldiers. Several military and diplomatic conversations have taken place. But just these two factors, how would you look at going forward, the pandemic and the clashes between India and Chinese soldiers in Ladakh?
Nice to be with you, Jyoti. Thank you, Vivek. Also, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think that, on the one hand, we are getting wrapped up in the pandemic and linking everything to the pandemic. So there is, some would say, an indirect causal chain whereby the pandemic has emerged from China. Other countries and all over the world have not handled it as well. They have not been able to suppress it and keep the numbers down. It has had a devastating economic impact. It's been distracting. It's exacerbated political polarization. It's made countries less able to concentrate on their strategic affairs. And therefore, China is taking advantage by pressing the Senkaku Islands, South China Sea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Ladakh, and so on and so forth, using debt trap diplomacy to advance its interests, catch the world off guard, never waste an opportunity. That's one narrative. But as we very well know, that when it comes to the situation of the multiple border disputes between China and India, these go back at this point 60 years, right? It's really more than 60 years, you might even say. And there has been pressing and probing and conflicts and tensions and casualties in just the last few years. So yes, we can see these two phenomena connecting. But you might also say that what's happening right now could very well have happened anyway. Because the truth is that if you believe the Chinese narrative, which of course we don't, but let's just take it at face value for hypothetical purposes, they're saying that they were provoked by India's road building activity, right? And Article 370. Now, those two things have nothing whatsoever to do with the pandemic, do they? So let's keep these things, I would say, on parallel tracks. My work, as you know, is focused a lot on the relationship between infrastructure and geopolitics. Now, China is very accustomed to being the one that has the upper hand and is on the front foot when it comes to using infrastructure as a tool of geopolitical expansion and pressing its interests, right? And now what they're witnessing is that India can play at that game too. India can build roads. India can build airstrips. India can deploy forces, heavy military forces, close to the border on its own sovereign territory and assert its interests. And that's not something that China is used to. So one can very much explain what's going on in this tit-for-tat kind of way without reference to the pandemic.
So that was my question, actually. When you said just now that China has been using infrastructure as leverage to promote its diplomacy, to expand its sphere of influence, not just in Asia, but across the world. But in Ladakh, so I just want to come back to Ladakh for a second. This is exactly what India has been doing, as you just said. So we've been building roads right up to the line of actual control. And now the Chinese have said, stop building those roads. So what is it about China? On the one hand, you have a line of actual control that has not been demarcated. They refuse to come to talks, to the talks table, to talk about this disputed boundary, which is, from Aksai Chin in the west to Arunachal Pradesh right in the east, 3,844 kilometers. So what is it about China? They don't like you to build the roads that they are building. They don't want to talk about this dispute. What is it that they want?
I suppose there's a couple of explanations. One, and the one that's most commonly floating around, is that China has always believed that it has time on its side, right? That it, and part and parcel of that is historical self-understanding, that if there is a territory that it has at any point in the past had some kind of suzerainty over, then it has claims to that again. And therefore, it should wait until it has maximum leverage over the adversary to press its claims. Now, let's remember, by the way, that when it comes to China and India, there's one thing that's exceptional, which is that China has settled borders with about 5 or 6 other countries. So India is the exception to that, because China has wanted to continue to hold out these disputes as leverage, both bilaterally and also in some ways to continue to justify the China-Pakistan strategic relationship on the basis of the logic that both China and Pakistan are threatened by India. But of course, at some point that becomes highly disingenuous, specious argument, much like most of the arguments that China makes in issues like this, because one could, of course, settle the border, but one is voluntarily choosing not to. And that is why I believe that the appropriate response is to continue to draw a very strong line, pardon the pun, but one should be asserting what one's view is of what the border is and make the de facto reality, press that into the Chinese mind and say, you will never cross this line. No matter how hard you try, no matter how powerful you think your military is, the cost to you will be far too high than is willing to pay. And therefore you must accept this de facto line as the de jure border. And history tells us not that China always gets what it wants. History tells us that if you stand up to China and make absolutely clear what your interest is, it's China that will, to some degree, accept that and realize that it's dealing with someone that cannot be sort of pushed around. And I think that, Doklam is not 100% a guidance in that regard, but it's partial evidence in that regard. And other countries have tried to do similar things. And where they do, you often find that China is not willing to pay the price, that it would rather take something easy, low-hanging fruit, than to fight for it.
So if you're suggesting that you have to stand up to this, to this big bully, Doklam, you said, was just, is a partial example of that. Give me another example where, somebody stood up to China and China didn't get its way.
Well, we have ongoing processes where that's happening, right? And it's not just territorial disputes, because quite frankly, territorial disputes, even as they pop up from time to time, such as this one, do not define our lives. There are almost zero, closer to zero than a meaningful number, of active international conflicts in the world today. They do not define us. The competition over connectivity, whether it's oil pipelines, roads, internet cables, and so forth, defines us, our competition in the world between powers, much, much more than any border dispute ever will, right? Because the value of infrastructure and the resources that flow through it is infinitely more valuable than 1 square kilometer of land in the Himalayas, just to be absolutely clear. So when I give you a couple of examples now, they don't necessarily just involve territory. But if you look at the very strong pushback that Vietnam is making against China when it comes to Paracel Island claims, it's already clear that China has taken what it has taken, and Vietnam will not get those islands back. Just 2 months ago, China designated 2 of the islands that it has taken in the Paracel cluster as administrative regions. It's not only colonized them, in other words, it has internalized them into the political bureaucracy. Vietnam will never get them back for 5,000 more years, right? But Vietnam has said, okay, now we know how to play this game, right? We're sending out our warships, our coast guards, our vessels. We're claiming these other islands. And China, best give up now. You will never get them, China, right? That kind of thing is happening on the sort of that in terms of territorial examples. And again, as I said before, China has settled boundaries with Kyrgyzstan, with Kazakhstan, with others, right? And in some cases, given up a little bit of land for the sake of settling the disputes. But that was in the 1990s when China was much weaker. Now, the broader set of examples that is, again, far, far more important are about the regulations of one's own economy. So Australia saying, sorry, China, you cannot buy into our telecom sector, right? Kazakhstan saying, sorry, China, you cannot have more than 49% ownership of any of our energy assets, right? That kind of thing. Mongolia saying, sorry, you're not going to be building the Chinese rail gauge in our country. It's going to be Russian rail gauge, right? These examples are seminal. They're so much more important, I'll be honest with you, than the Ladakh dispute in the grand scheme of things. Way more. Because those absolutely make clear that China, if it's building something for another country, it's never going to get to own it, which is part of its plan. Those countries have the sovereignty, the legal sophistication to block China. And that those kinds of transactions, they'll never make the front page of any newspaper in the world. But I assure you that they're significantly more important than whether one border goes one way or the other.
So, obviously I'm not in total agreement with you, because even though it's a few square kilometers in sort of the wastelands of Ladakh, if you like, but it's obviously not just politically important, but, your whole sort of public perception has been tied into now how strong you are. But I have another question for you, Parag. You're sitting in Singapore, which is almost like a listening post for China. You're close enough to be able to gauge the temperature, if you like, but you're also, far enough to be able to figure out what the rest of the region is thinking about. So what is the rest of the region saying? You apart from Vietnam, what is Singapore saying, for example?
Well, the countries of Southeast Asia don't focus too much on India. There is a large, obviously, South Indian population here in Singapore. It's, 15, 20% of the population. But India's geopolitics doesn't figure very largely. It's been part of the Indian agenda, particularly under Prime Minister Modi, to promote a look east policy and an act east policy, to trade more with ASEAN, to develop strong military ties, which it now has, with Japan, with Australia, to strengthen those ties with the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia, to invite Asian countries into the Malabar exercises, and to join the Quad arrangement with Japan and Australia and the United States. So yes, there is, in terms of sentiment, in terms of some degree of action and coordination, India is starting to figure a little bit more here. But it's not as palpable on the ground as the strategy looks on paper. I endorse the strategy. I think it's a very good idea. I know that it's the strategy that Asian countries want, but it's not something that you feel and see every single day. Let's remember that India did not join the RCEP trade agreement that was ratified by a large number of governments last year. India has its own reasons for doing so, which I also fully understand. But let's be clear that one doesn't, in a day-to-day way, in Singapore or elsewhere in Southeast Asia, worry about the Sino-Indian dispute in Ladakh, because every country here has its own relationships and issues and challenges with China on a daily basis, and those are more front and center. So Belt and Road projects are one example, trade access, competition for foreign investment, or playing off Chinese and Japanese companies or conglomerates for investment in the tech sector. That stuff makes the news every single day. And of course, South China Sea issues make the news every day. If the government of the Philippines has decided to cave in on certain commercial deals or island disputes with China, that makes the news every single day. But India is still a little bit too far away in the Southeast Asian psyche. As someone, again, I travel to all of the countries in the region every single week, except for a present, special situation that we're in right now. But when you're in Myanmar, even, and of course, as we all know, Myanmar was part of the British Raj.
In 1935, it was part of British India.
But as you know very well, when you go to Myanmar today, you still don't really feel India. You don't feel the presence, and it's something that, again, we want to see a lot more of, not just as a geopolitical counterbalance. Let's be clear, India is more virtuous than simply being a large country that can supposedly balance China, because even that proposition is fanciful, other than in certain geographies. It's much more about the fact that it is intimate to the region's history, to its cultural history, civilizational history, economic history, demographic history, that India play a more prominent role here. And I have no question that it's going to happen and that it should accelerate. But your question is about right now. Yeah. And right now, that's not what's going on.
Okay, so I'm going to come to Belt and Road in a second, but I'd like to ask you, inside China, we've seen the Global Times, which is the English website of the Chinese Communist Party, sort of a mouthpiece, really, which has come out very, very strongly on the Ladakh clashes, claiming Galwan Valley, when, of course, the Indians say that Galwan is a settled territory and it belongs to India. But something that's interesting is that in the Ladakh clashes, in which 20 Indian soldiers died, and there were several casualties on the Chinese side as well. Now, the Chinese are refusing to come out with those figures. So what is it that they are that they're afraid of?
They're not refusing to disclose the casualties on their side because they're afraid of something. They're failing to disclose it because it doesn't have significant enough resonance to them domestically. I mean, of course, if it was a high figure and it were known domestically, then they could actually use that to inflame Chinese passions against India even further. And in doing so, that would not lead to an outcome that you would want, because then they would use that to stoke themselves on further and continue their aggressive advance. So in some ways, we should be grateful. Also, they always want to portray happy news, good news, positive news about China. They'd much rather portray, as they have been doing on more or less the same day as this was happening. And in fact, this is what they did. They portrayed the bilateral phone call between Xi Jinping and the president of Zambia, I think it was. That was the lead story in the Global Times that day. So why talk about bad news of a border skirmish in which you suffered casualties when your people could not care less and when you can just gloss right over it, right? And again, hold that in your pocket, for later on. If you need to announce that your own nationals have been martyred in an overseas operation, save it for when you really need to stoke up the nationalism for a full-on escalation of the conflict, which is again not something that they necessarily want. Again, they like to gain these territories by stealth, incrementally, without conflict, and hopefully without the other side noticing. And the difference between the China/global interactions of 3 years ago versus today is that now everyone notices everything China does. And the way I describe it is that China is going through the imperial life cycle, from supply chain expansion and foreign investment to co-opting elites and using corruption to acquire assets to building up debt traps, exercising strong leverage and influence over politics, to breeding resentment and backlash and being thrown out of countries. That's the full imperial life cycle. That's the British in India over 300 years, right? Except with China and other countries, that process is happening in 3 years, not 300 years. And that's the difference between the colonial world and the post-colonial world. Because of sovereignty, because of democracy, because of transparency, the awakening, the role of civil society, and the fact that so many people in these countries, whether it is India, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is African countries, because they have lived through colonialism and the Cold War, they don't want to be fools and stooges and pawns a third time around in their own lifetimes, right? So China will have a much, much, much more difficult time asserting itself globally. This is why I don't like analogies to the British East India Company, or to American imperial expansionism, as if it's an easy ride for China simply because it's powerful. Because we have something much deeper going on, which is a psychological evolution in particularly the post-colonial world, which is most of the planet has already been there and doesn't want it to happen again. So nothing that Britain was able to achieve or that America was able to achieve in terms of global influence will come easily to China. In fact, it is so insurmountable, the obstacles that China faces, that I don't get particularly worked up about China as a global power, because first of all, unlike Britain and unlike America, China has 14 neighbors, many of which are powerful, all of which belong to different civilizations, many of which have a sense of centrality about themselves and exceptionalism, as India does, all of which are suspicious of China, and therefore will do their level best to prevent any such historical cyclical recurrence.
That's fascinating. So let's broaden the canvas a bit. And, from your comments, what I would like to ask next is about the US. Now, a lot of people say that the US is a declining power. And we're not just talking about Trump, even though elections are on the horizon in the US. But I think if you just look at the last 20 or 30 years, ever since the end of the Cold War, and actually your book also, The Future is Asian, also connects with my question, which is that how does the rise of China, does it have to be a zero-sum game with the relative decline of the US? Do you think that the US is just going to roll up and and say, okay, I mean, I'm so I'm being sort of beaten and bullied, so I'm opting out.
Well, what's happening is not a zero-sum game. America's relative decline, measured in economic terms, began in the 1970s with the rise of the Japanese economy and the consolidation of the European Union. Even though the U.S. won the Cold War and the Soviet Union collapsed, into the 1990s, America was obviously the sole military superpower in the world. But fundamentally, we measure power in economic terms. And again, the relative decline had already begun. Now we're in a situation where the tables have more or less turned, where the US and Europe together represent less than half of global GDP, and Asia represents a full half of global GDP. So you have a tripolar global system, or you have three major regional systems that are quite independent of each other now. And that's the way the world is going to be for a long time. North America, with the United States as the anchor of that system. The European Union, with Germany and associated central powers as the anchors and motors of that system. And then you have the Asian system. And the Asian system has multiple drivers. It has China, Japan, India, Korea, Australia, Russia, and Southeast Asian countries. So the Asian system is almost becoming a self-contained universe. That doesn't make it peaceful, because it's not. But it does make it far more integrated than it has been in several hundred years. So the point is that America remains a superpower, but does it have the capacity or the will, the credibility, the alliances to actually exercise that power globally? And if so, to what end would it even do so, right?
What do you think? Do you think it does?
Well, I mean, the willpower may vary based upon what the impetus is, whether it is provoked or not. If you have a premeditated Chinese attack on an American aircraft carrier, all the isolationism in America that is bipartisan and shared, the desire to retrench and focus on building at home, that's all going to go out the window, and they're going to roll up their sleeves and they're going to want war, right? I mean, I served in America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan myself in 2007 in the Special Operations Forces. And let's face it, it doesn't take much of a trigger to get Americans to, want to send their neighbors out, not usually themselves, send their neighbors out to die. And so, they're not going to back down. But it's going to be ugly, obviously, right now, given just how, sort of beaten up the American military is from those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the point is that, on the one hand, America wants to rebuild at home. On the other hand, it has these legacy commitments abroad. And it has a very difficult time intellectually prioritizing and shedding any of those commitments and those legacy, that presence around the world, because it's just typical psychological inertia and scope creep and mission creep. We've all been there, and whether it's in our professional lives or whether it's the portfolio of your investments or the number of houses you may own, once you have something, you find it hard to get rid of it. Right, it becomes part of your sense of self and self-worth. And the U.S., has had a hard time prioritizing, saying, why are we still protecting Saudi Arabia? We, America, are the world's largest energy producer. We have zero need for energy from the Middle East. Let those guys figure it out on their own and to get along with their neighbors. Why are we serving as an artificial crutch? Now, you can make that argument, and some of the finest strategic thinkers in the U.S. make that argument. But once you're in government, a whole other set of incentives kick in, where you have to demonstrate your relevance. You have to be muscular. You have to be out there. So, but right now, when you look at the mismatch between the economic realities and the kind of lack of credibility of the American missions abroad, the wise course would be to retrench.
So is China taking that place?
No, because again, it's much more complicated than that, right? It's not really a flat board game of risk in which if one space is left empty, you roll the dice and you land on it and you take it over, right? Again, this is not the colonial world. This is not the Cold War world. Divide and rule politics doesn't work anymore. The rest of the world has a say, it has a voice, and it's certainly not naive anymore. So the rest of the world is the key swing states here that will prevent China from filling those vacuums if it stands up. So we have to remember one very important thing. Geopolitics is very non-linear, right? If you remember back after 2001, and after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when the U.S. invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, you had people talking about hyperpower, right? This was presumably you had an extension of the American 1990s post-war supremacy and unipolar dominance of the world. The ability of the United States to, occupy countries on the other side of the planet, landlocked places, and to bestride the world with troops in 100 different places. It's hyperpower all over again. Well, we're not talking about hyperpower anymore, right? So geopolitics is very nonlinear. Right now, we're talking about China's, irrevocable ascent, its path to being number one, world's largest economy, largest trading partner of 128 countries, and a Belt and Road Initiative with 100 members. Clearly, China will be number one, and everyone else will wither. And that just seems to fit a nice pattern of the passing of the baton, peacefully or violently, from Great Britain to America to China. And a lot of people who think they're really smart like to, pretend that this is the way history works. And it's not. It's not even close, right? It's a lot messier, a lot more complicated. The vast duration of human history has been characterized by multipolar orders, messy, diffuse, non-hierarchical multipolar orders, especially in Asia. And Asia is what matters more. So the fact is that China is not going to dominate Asia because it never has. Only the Mongols have ever dominated Asia. And fun fact, it was the Black Death that brought that to an end. And I fully expect actually the backlash against China resulting from their suppression of information about the coronavirus is going to accelerate, not China's geopolitical, if you will, drawdown, rather than accelerate it, as people are saying right now. So again, look for the nonlinear elements in all of this. And I see, I basically believe with 100%, sort of confidence that we're moving towards a multipolar Asia and a multipolar world, not China simply replacing America. Can you name a country on the planet Earth besides China that wants China to be in their neighborhood, protecting them as their hegemon? The answer is zero. And therefore, the final outcome of all of this, again, violently or peacefully, will be precisely that.
Fair enough. But, you've said somewhere that some of the American companies that you advise or speak to have sometimes said that they wish that America could join the Belt and Road.
Yes, what they mean, of course, is that they want America to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They want America to join the Belt and Road. They want America not to impose tariffs on countries where you're going to have reciprocal, economic suffering. They want access to growing markets. It's not a sophisticated statement. It's simply multinational companies want to sell automobiles.
They're willing to divorce the political from the economic, right?
Well, so the thing is that, again, if you want to have preferential access, or if you want to compete with Chinese companies to sell tractors or whatever the case may be, or to build infrastructure in emerging markets that are part of Belt and Road, you have to be inside the tent. Simply criticizing China from outside the tent doesn't get you anywhere. Now, I hope that you're also drawing the inference to India, because India didn't join Belt and Road. India did not show up in 2017. India did not show up in 2019. And every time I've said, look, I obviously understand the symbolic importance of rejecting, the Belt and Road Initiative because of the fact that some of the projects associated with it traverse Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Right. But of course, those projects predate Belt and Road by about 60 years. So they're not really Belt and Road projects. They're bilateral China-Pakistan projects. But what if you, as an Indian company, and India has many companies, India has some of the largest engineering and construction companies in the world, not to mention many other categories of vendors and services, from software to whatever the case may be. Just look at what India has done in Afghanistan and other places, right? Very positive impact. So if you want to have access to those countries where China is locking up deals, bribing leaders, having the commercial sector in its back pocket, you actually should join Belt and Road. And you should be undermining China from within. You should be saying, hey, you should be going to Tajikistan and going to Kazakhstan and saying, hey, we're part of Belt and Road too. We're all bye-bye. Let's have Indians get the deal here, not just the Chinese. And that, by the way, is not a naive proposition. This is precisely the entire history of multilateralism in 2 sentences. What's happened is that the United States and European countries created this global liberal international order, as we call it, United Nations and Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF in 1945. Now, how did China and other emerging markets get more influence over the global economic system? By rejecting the WTO? No, by joining the WTO, right? By not taking IMF money? No, by actually lobbying to have a greater share of votes in the IMF and the World Bank, right? So you weaken, you assert yourself. You're not succoring, you're not subjugating, you're not prostrating before China to join Belt and Road. You're actually participating in what should be a concerted global diplomatic effort to undermine Belt and Road from within. Pretend the Belt and Road is named World Bank and copy what China has done with World Bank and World Trade Organization over the last 30 years. You join it and you say, hey, wait a minute. If this is actually a shared, equitable, brotherly, fraternal, multilateral umbrella like you say it is, Beijing, surely you shouldn't be getting 95% of the deals. That's quite embarrassing, isn't it? Right? And then China will say, oh, just like America did, just like France and Britain and America had to do in the 70s, 80s, 90s. They say, oh, yes. In fact, please don't leave this organization. It'll be deeply embarrassing for us if you join Belt and Road, then quit. So we will give you more and more of the deals. And that's what the Germans should do. That's what India should do. And that's what America should do. They say, oh, it's a fabulous idea that you want to finance global infrastructure. Lots of countries need it. We absolutely, surely, Beijing, you want to make sure this is done in a non-corrupt fashion with sustainable financial practices, don't you? But this is not a joke, because this is precisely how China guilt-tripped the West into increasing its leverage in our multilateral institutions. And you must do to China what China has done to the world. And that's why, again, the smart countries say, oh, you want to invest here, but we don't have reciprocal access to your market, right? You want everyone to be able to use, China's credit cards and mobile phone systems and social media apps. Oh, sorry, that's just not going to be allowed for a while because we can't sell these things in your country, right? And that's what the Germans are waking up to, the French are waking up to, the Brits are waking up to, the Americans are waking up to. Everyone just needs to do to China what China has done to them. That's all it takes to fix this, this linear fear that we have that China is gobbling the world. There's a one-word solution to every problem, and it's reciprocity. That's it.
But Parag, I take your point. But if you talk to the Germans, they admit that German industry is panicking in the wake of the coronavirus, that if the world is changing and if markets are going to get more and more elusive. So the Germans are wondering, okay, the politics is on one side, but what are we going to do if we can't sell our cars in China? So I think it's all very well for thinkers like you to say, hey, I think you should, use some sort of leverage in terms of reciprocity. But that's not how business thinks, right?
No, but this is exactly what is happening. First of all, Volkswagen has been one of the best-selling cars in China. And in the high-end market, it's been Mercedes and BMW. These companies' market cap would be 2/3 of what they are right now if they were not selling as much as they are in China. And the reason why China right now is allowing Deutsche Bank and Standard Chartered and JP Morgan and Credit Suisse and UBS to take full ownership of their onshore operations in the insurance sector and other financial services is precisely because of the pushback, precisely because Swiss banks and regulators and German regulators are saying, sorry, China, we're not going to let you buy this company and that company and this sensitive asset and this high-tech company. Sorry, because it's not non-reciprocal. So the entire liberalization of the Chinese financial sector that's happening right now is precisely because for the last 3.5 years, Western economies have been getting tougher on China. So when you describe them as freaking out, they have already been freaking out. And this stronger policy that's emerging today is the result of that, not the result of the coronavirus.
So point taken. Now, so taking off from there, I'm just wondering, as China expands its influence in South Asia, for example, which India has traditionally considered its own sphere of influence. Meanwhile, India and Pakistan have a very, there is no formal relationship at all. Increasingly with Nepal, there has been a lot of problems. But I'm just wondering if China and Pakistan have this, higher than the mountains, deeper than the seas, this sort of this strategic relationship, then should India perhaps patch up with the Pakistanis to be able to sort of, do whatever you suggested earlier, which is to try and get into the tent rather than stay out of it?
It's a great question, and quite frankly, I want to applaud you for even asking it, because as you very well know, it's not the kind of thing that people raise in India nearly enough, and I happen to think it's a great idea. But let me back end into endorsing it further. First, by saying that it's a very curious understanding of the phrase sphere of influence that Indians have about themselves when you do not have good relations with any of your neighbors, but you portray yourself as having a sphere of influence. Now, my deepest academic training is in geopolitical theory. So if I know the definition of one phrase in the world, it's sphere of influence. And I can tell you that India's understanding does not exactly comport with the historical understanding. I'm not accusing you at all, because I know that you are paraphrasing India's self-understanding. And so I want all Indians to know that our Indian understanding of sphere of influence has almost zero correlation to the actual, because you're actually supposed to build those relations in a way that has those countries, seeking to be under your umbrella, right? Because otherwise, if you want to call it, violent hegemony and suppression of weaker states, even if they reject you, well, then call it that, right? But that's also not what India has when it comes to its relationship with its neighbors. It's neither domination nor is it acceptance. So it's a poor man's sphere of influence. So which gets to your question. You're very important. So what if India actually wanted to be seen as a benevolent, protector in this sphere of influence and earn the sort of title, as of having this sphere of influence? What would it do? And of course, it would need to have better relations with its key neighbors. So we've seen India try to patch up with Sri Lanka, for example, after the Hambantota port fiasco. Right. We've seen the border resolution with Bangladesh, and we've seen that they've found ways, despite the fence building and so forth, to continue, some degree of stable, migration, obviously economic relations, diplomatic ties stronger, and so forth. I think that has a positive potential there. Also, environmental cooperation, electricity, hydropower, all of these things will be very important with Bangladesh. With Nepal, it's been a bit of a, one step forward, one step sideways, there are a couple of own goals in there. But obviously, Nepal, like Bhutan, is existentially worried about China and not existentially worried about India. So I think that ultimately there'll be a, stronger degree of cooperation there. Which leaves, of course, Pakistan. Now, I don't think that you can, sort of pull Pakistan out of China's orbit, right? Obviously, you could say, okay, it's a far-fetched, a long-term vision might be to reunify South Asia and undo the wounds of partition, right? So if you wanted to get to that end state, there are about 10 steps you would have to take mutually, of course, between India and Pakistan along the way. And you would have to hope that, unlike the last 20 years, each positive step is not undone by some negative event or phenomenon, right? So yes, I could imagine, emphasis on the word imagine, something like that happening. But we obviously there is not interlocutors on the Pakistan side where they have the long-term credibility to make any such gestures. So, at this point, it's not going to happen. But as with many other cases around the world, you can clearly see, because Pakistan is not an exception to what I'm describing as a universal post-colonial logic, the desire to not be colonized, right? Again and again and again. To not be, a U.S. pawn or a British, sort of territory or whatever the case may be. And that sentiment does exist in Pakistan. It is not the dominant narrative, but it's very, very palpable. Now, if you look at their media and you talk to some of their people, they are measuring every single day, wait, what's our debt from China? What is the volume of loans we're taking? Does this electricity plant have to be built by them? How much of the revenue offtake from this power generation is going to be sent back to China over the next 30 or 40 years versus if we did it ourselves, if we took financing from someone else, right, it would cost us less. Just today, it was announced that they're seeking a very, very clear debt relief on bilateral Belt and Road projects from Pakistan, right? And it's going to be a very important test of China's credibility, whether or not they can issue this significant debt forgiveness. So my point is that there are fractures in this so-called higher than the mountains, deeper than the seas, strategic relationship. There are fissures in there. And over time, you can well imagine, you really can, that China will not need Pakistan as much as it seems to right now and has needed it historically, and that there could be a mutually beneficial set of initiatives that India and Pakistan can undertake together.
That's fascinating, and I have a last couple of questions before I think Vivek would like to open this up. Now, if you're saying that India should reach out to its neighborhood, and I would agree with that. Similarly, do you think that the other big power, the US, how about India and the US coming much closer together? Is this one of those moments then?
Well, my view on this is that India is one of the many countries that has shifted from non-alignment to multi-alignment. And the highest, the smartest diplomatic strategy that a country can have in a multipolar world is multi-alignment. Again, why would you choose one side when it may not be the winning side, and when you could rather play all sides and get benefits from everyone? Trade more with China, have better ties with Russia, push for a free trade agreement with the European Union, and have deep military ties with the United States. So a smart Indian foreign policy, and of course to have have an alliance with Japan. That's what India is doing right now. So in terms of broad 360-degree contours, that's called multi-alignment. And that's what India should do and always do and never not do. So no matter how close one is with the US, never have a foreign power dictating to you what you can and cannot do with your other relationships, right? So there might be areas where it's still advantageous for India to be doing business with China. China is, of course, one of the largest investors in India. Now, of course, India is going to restrict sensitive investments, beneficial owners of mainland Chinese entities in the Indian technology sector or finance. That's fine, but there'll still be a decent, fair amount of foreign investment from China and India. Now, America will also invest more, and America will sell more weapons to India, but India should also be dealing with Russia, with Japan, with everyone. And that ultimately enhances India's power and its bargaining power and leverage in negotiations with respect to China. So by all means, get closer to America, but be closer to everyone. That's how smart diplomacy is done.
I think exactly, just as the External Affairs Minister, S. Jaishankar, said, we continue to pick our own side. I thought that was a really evocative line. So,
yeah.
But tell me about, so I just want to come back to you on how the Chinese are looking inside at the coronavirus pandemic. Now, there was this diary, the Wong Feng diary, the Fang Feng diary, which, as you know, this poet or the writer who lived in Wuhan and through the 72 days as the city changed around her, people died, and she wrote a diary, which is now being published in the US as well. But how do the Chinese, who think of themselves, I'm sure, as no longer a poor country, how do they look at this pandemic, that this virus that's been unleashed across the world because of something that they love to eat, or, how this whole thing went crazy. But how do they look at the pandemic?
I actually believe that China is not a country that necessarily speaks with one voice, right? And I think that from the outside, it's very easy to caricature a Chinese view, have a nationalistic view, a patriotic view. But I spend a lot of time in China, and even if you don't, you can read from many other voices the fact that there's a lot of debate in China, a lot of criticism. I mean, this recounting of the situation in Wuhan is one example of that. But Chinese social media is a hotbed of debate, of criticism of the government, and so on. But what Chinese value, and quite frankly, what all people intrinsically value, whether you live in a democratic or an authoritarian society today, is that even if your government has made mistakes, is it resilient? Does it bounce back? Is it responsive? Right? Because of course, no one knows the exact origin. Well, I mean, I'm guessing that there are people there, and I'd love to chat with them to know exactly whether this virus came from a wet market or a weapons lab or whatever the case may be. So, in China, as you can imagine, I mean, every country, especially a developing, modernizing country, is rife with conspiracy theories. So in that sense, we would have a lot in common with the Chinese. They also love to spread conspiracy theories online. And, they have a healthy, vibrant, vigorous, debate about these things. A lot of it gets scrubbed instantaneously on Weibo and WeChat and so on.
They do have healthy debate about these issues.
Of course they do.
We continue
Absolutely.
to China as being, as where the media is controlled and therefore nothing comes out.
But you know how many statements, not only by not leaving aside those dissidents or exiles, billionaire exiles in New York and Hong Kong or wherever, who are publishing these critical statements of Xi Jinping, just inside China, the scholars who publish in Mandarin their manifestos warning that the government is too authoritarian, that it's not handled the virus well. This stuff is in the public domain, and it gets translated, and we see that. So we know that there's a diversity of opinions. I mean, have you ever been in an educated society where there's not a diversity of opinions? A. Is China an educated society? Yes. Therefore, China is a society with a very, very high degree of internal discussion and debate and discourse. Extremely vibrant, actually. And again, I've been to China so many times and been part of these conversations. So,
Do you speak Chinese?
No, I don't. So I have a phalanx of translators wherever I go in Beijing. But it's been actually an incredible experience, actually, to be in roomfuls of 1,000, 2,000 students and hear them sometimes arguing with their professors as if I'm not even there, or responding to things that I've said. Right? I mean, once you're inside China, there's a lot of things that you can say that we don't think that you can say when you're in China, but you can.
Like what?
In terms of being critical. So there's a lot more, of course, there's a lot of self-censorship, right? A very high degree of self-censorship. The censorship applies to that margin of things that are considered by the government to be sort of too extreme, right? But the scope of things around which one speaks in a self-censoring way, but still is able to speak about them, it's just you guard how you speak about them, is almost everything, right? So, I think, again, I've been I believe that I've said for a long, long time, this was probably my first book, I said that, China should lighten up, right? Its people trust its government because they've gotten them this far. They should actually lighten up and allow much more, sort of openness. And they're overreacting because they tend to govern through the lens of the past. And many countries make this mistake. But I'm not sure if and when that's ever going to happen, right? In China. But that said, there's what we call as-if culture, right? People will, the government will act as if they have control over people's thoughts, and the people will act as if they care, so to speak. But so Chinese, so long as the government allows these release valves where people can sufficiently complain. But let me just get back to the most important thing. The government is responsive, right? They messed up, and they know they messed up. They know that in the various levels of authority, there was suppression of information to avoid giving negative information up the food chain, up the command chain. And they realize they messed up. Now, what the people must be saying today is, we know they messed up. But did they respond quickly? And meanwhile, look what's happening in the US. Thank God I live in China, right? Forgive, but not forget.
You think that people are saying that?
Absolutely. That's what they're, absolutely. No question about it.
So then Xi Jinping's authority over his country is that much more compounded. And
remember that, again, many intellectuals very vigorously resent his overreach and his deepening of authoritarianism rather than promotion of greater liberalism and opening at precisely the time that, quite frankly, China could afford to become much more liberal and open. So absolutely they resent that because they've only become more educated and better informed over time, correct? Yes. However, there is, again, this sort of forgiveness element. We understand how the process works. There is one party that's in charge. They are responsive and they are fixing the problem. They are learning to make the situation better so they won't repeat these mistakes. They are giving us certain release valves to air our concerns and annoyances on this and other issues. However, compared to America, right, they'd rather be where they are right now. So there is that element as well. These are complex emotions that have to be synthesized. There isn't one side of the argument or the other that has to win or prevail.
Right. And what do they say about Trump? I mean, just curious.
Well, that's a bit more, I think that one can there's lots of surveys about this, articles about this, and then there's obviously the language. So on the one hand, they could be, sort of criticizing some of his foreign policy decisions. Obviously, they don't want to see the United States selling more arms to Taiwan, but it is. They don't want to see the United States Congress passing legislation in the defense of Hong Kong, right? They resent that. There are many things about American foreign policy that obviously are considered alien. The freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, right? The way the trade war is going, they obviously blame the U.S. more than themselves. On the other hand, as you may know, they relish the idea of Trump winning a second term, because he's so divisive domestically that they're actually helping to pump up the U.S. stock market in after-hours trading in order to ensure that, or to hopefully they'll be able to support this transmission mechanism of sufficient economic stimulus in the U.S. to get Trump reelected, because they think that his divisiveness and chaos will ultimately strengthen them. That's an example of thinking a few steps ahead.
Right. So, in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism, the control of the Chinese Communist Party, these debates are still ongoing. And
well, there's varieties of democracy and varieties of authoritarianism. That's the thing, right? And so I view these things as much more as a spectrum of poor governance to good governance. And there's, any number of less than democratic states that are, better governed than democratic states. And to me, the continuum is bad governance to good governance, not democracy to authoritarianism.
Right, Parag, I think, right now we're so consumed in India about China vis-a-vis the clashes, of course. And of course, we're right in the middle of dealing with this pandemic here in Delhi. It's the worst hit city. But before I hand over the baton to Vivek, I just want to tell you and all our viewers here about ThePrint. I don't know if you've seen ThePrint, Parag. And,
of course I have.
Good. So just to all of you, I work with ThePrint. We are a very young website. So please do watch us, read us. It's theprint.in. And back to you, Vivek.
My specific question is this, that do you see much more to this happening now than this happening like 6 months before, or 12 months before, or 6 months down the line?
Well, we can't know what would have happened if they had pursued these steps 6 months into the future versus now. But again, what they point to on the Chinese side is that India has been stepping up this road construction activity, and then there was the Article 370 issue. And all of that is in the last roughly 1 to 2 years, right? So for them, it's what India has done in the last 1 to 2 years that allows them to pretend to portray that it's some kind of change of the status quo. Again, they can get away on their side to their own audience in portraying that, because how many people in Beijing have any bloody clue where the Galwan Valley is, right? It's not a border that they think about a lot. I remember traveling through Tibet and Xinjiang in the year 2006. I actually drove through Aksai Chin. So I spent some time going over those passes, and I drove, it's called the Western Highway, and it connects Tibet to Xinjiang. And it was absolutely the most laborious, death death-defying and many literally near-death experiences on this trip. It took me 2 to 3 months to get from Lhasa to Urumqi in China, driving on those roads and through Aksai Chin. And of course, they hadn't completed any of the roads that they now use either. And this has been obviously what India has done on the Indian side is incredibly, is quite a feat of engineering as well. But as I was in those regions, the very, very few Han Chinese who make it out there. I mean, there are many Han Chinese that are being pushed now to go and live in Urumqi and in Chinese cities to develop the West and to be part of this ethnic dilution and colonization campaign. But the most curious thing to me was seeing Chinese citizens, ordinary citizens, arriving by bus or train to Xinjiang for the first time as tourists. And when they would get out of these vehicles, you could clearly tell they'd absolutely never imagined that there's any part of China that looks like this, right? But to them, it was literally as if they had been put on a plane and sent to Bolivia. It was literally as if they were not in China anymore. And that is the distance, the geographic distance and the cultural distance. Remember that Tibet and Xinjiang are China's 2 largest provinces by far geographically, but the smallest populations as well. And they're very, very, very far away, right? And so to them, it's just this remote frontier. They don't think about it at all. I guess it's 1.1 billion Chinese who live, in Eastern China have really never given this geography any thought. Which is, again, going back to Jyoti's question, why is it not on the front page of the Global Times? It really doesn't have to be. They actually couldn't care less.
That sounds like us a bit, doesn't it?
Parag, we got a question from one of our members who's watching this from his residence. With China buying its influence with countries around India, is the neighborhood lost to us for the foreseeable future?
No, it's a great question. As I said, geopolitics is nonlinear. It is never lost. You can have a situation where, let's go back to the Hambantota port example, right? In terms of nonlinearity. So for those who don't know the story, Sri Lanka turned to India first, more than a decade ago, and said, will you help us develop our port infrastructure? And India typically, sort of dropped the ball, prevaricated, thought about it, never got back to them. And in the meantime, the Chinese turned to the Sri Lankans turned to China and said, okay, you just do it. And Sri Lanka, the Chinese were like, oh, okay, great. If India's not going to do it, it's sort of, it fell in their laps. Now, what's the typical portrayal of the Sri Lanka episode? It's, the Chinese have been scheming for 600 years to return to the Ming Dynasty treasure fleet era and assert themselves in the Indian Ocean by recreating a string of pearls of ports that are their allies. Bullshit. Hambantota fell into China's lap because India dropped the ball. It was a pure accident, right? There is no 600-year Chinese plan to recreate Zheng He's treasure fleets, right? But it's portrayed that way in retrospect. But now, when what happened is that because the Hambantota port lease was given to China for 99 years, and that led to such an outcry domestically, and it reverberated internationally, you haven't had other cases like Hambantota port. So again, think in complexity terms. Why will you never have a Hambantota port-like situation again in Pakistan or Kenya or other countries? It's because Hambantota happened, and the next day, the cabinets of governments got together in Kenya, in Pakistan, in Myanmar, and they all said, oh my God, look what just happened to Sri Lanka. Let us do everything that we can to avoid becoming like Sri Lanka. And that's what avoids these linear scenarios from unfolding, where every country falls like a domino, like Sri Lanka, to China. Because it happened, it will not happen again, right? That's the way the real world actually works. There are these incredibly fast learning effects that go on. And so you have to look to kind of what's the next thing. So in these countries' elections now, China is such a elephant in the room that the even though somehow miraculously, I think we know enough about how Sri Lankan politics works, that somehow the Rajapaksa family, weaseled its way back in. But what kind of deals can you really cut with China today and fully get away with? Do you really think that China is going to be able to put its submarines and warships transparently in the ports of these countries? Remember what we were discussing earlier when it comes to the post-colonial kind of mindset, the difference between the 21st century and the 18th century. There's democracy, there's sovereignty, there's transparency, right? And these factors prevent China from simply being able to buy a port, bribe a government, and put its warships there in this linear fashion, because everyone is watching everything that China does and is going to start pushing back and pushing back and pushing back to avoid these debt traps. Even where the term debt trap is actually sort of a misnomer. In fact, in the case of Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan officials go out of their way every day to say the Hambantota port deal was not a response to a Chinese debt trap. We, Sri Lanka, owe much more money to the World Bank than we do to China. We actually did this lease to China to raise money to pay off Western creditors, not to pay off China, right? So even where the term debt trap is wrong and inappropriate, it's a fabulously powerful term because it creates this rallying cry against becoming indebted to China that is now a feature of every country's politics in the region. So it's a long way of saying that Asia is not lost to China, right? The Indian Ocean is not lost to China. South Asia is not lost to China, because for every action there's a reaction, and the reaction could wind up being far more important than whatever China did. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Let me give you one very important example: Belt and Road. Belt and Road was created 5 years ago. In the last 3 years, it's gotten the world's attention since the 2017 summit and the 2019 summit. In the year 2017, did the following institutions or initiatives exist? The European Union's Asia Connectivity Initiative, the United States-Australia Blue Dot Network, the United States International Development Finance Corporation, the India-Japan Connectivity Corridors, and on and on and on. In the last 3 years, every other country has created a sum total of about a dozen initiatives to compete with Belt and Road. Now, before Belt and Road existed, these initiatives had no reason to exist. But because Belt and Road exists, it has created this counter-reaction to dilute and undermine Belt and Road. Which will win? It's the latter, right? Belt and Road will not win because everyone is now competing with Belt and Road to make sure it does not win. But if Belt and Road didn't exist, we wouldn't be reacting to it. That's complexity. That's the way the world really works.
So just want to follow up on one point you made there on the debt trap. I mean, I get it. I guess it's still playing out, but you look at Venezuela, you look at the way even Pakistan's headed. How do you see these countries claw themselves out of this debt trap? I mean, is this something that it's a paper sort of notional amount that they owe, or do they have sovereign risk associated with this debt?
No, it's a great question. So let me break this down, because when we use the term, we have to remember that the countries that are most heavily indebted to China have been heavily indebted to China since before Belt and Road existed, because they have been debt orphans, right? I mean, Mongolia and Kyrgyzstan don't just rock up to Washington and New York and London and issue $15 billion of debt and have anyone biting at it, right? It doesn't happen. They have been debt orphans for decades. They might as well be African countries. The reason these countries are in debt traps to China now is because, again, they have been for 20 years, right? Most poor countries in the world are like this. They have one patron in the world. If they're lucky, they often have zero. So Belt and Road has simply made a very high amount of debt a little bit higher, but not even necessarily that much higher. So that's part one of the answer. Part two is, if you don't take on debt as a poor country, you'll never grow. How are you going to finance a road? How are you going to finance an electricity grid? How are you going to build infrastructure? If you don't have those things, you're a worthless geography. So at some level, you have to borrow from someone at some time in order to grow. The only question is who. Now, when you borrow from China, it comes with certain opacity, with certain strings attached. But most countries, not the kind of useless backwaters like Laos or whatever, right? The countries that really matter in terms of evaluating China's long-term influence in the world are not Laos. Does anyone in this room care what happens to Laos? You don't admit it, right? The countries that matter are Pakistan, are Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Russia, Kenya, South Africa, right? The really important second-tier sort of countries in the world. That's where it will be decided whether or not, Belt and Road and Chinese economic and financial partnerships have proven to be worthwhile. And I'll tell you what, the countries that are smart, and there's quite a few of them, are actually making the most of the China opportunity. Right? If you look at the Central Asian countries, especially Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, hugely strategic, geographically, well-positioned countries, they are growing gangbusters, right? The foreign investment is coming in because China has come in. So China has that first mover advantage, right? A lot of people didn't want to invest in these countries, but China went in. Now they're diversifying their economies. They've got pipelines. They've got highways. Now, guess what? The German companies are coming in and saying, oh, we want to do our food processing plants here. We want to build cars here. Do you really think the European companies would have put a penny into Uzbekistan until China did? No way. So China, again, is actually in some countries kicking off a process that is the correct process, which is where foreign investment comes in from China or whomever. Those countries actually use it smartly. They diversify, they create jobs, they modernize their infrastructure. Then suddenly those countries become attractive, and the Americans and the Germans and the Brits and the French and Indians also come into those countries. And then they wind up raising the capital to pay off China. That's the way it is supposed to work. And that is how it works in large, smart countries. And so, that's why you have 100 members. I mean, no one would have had a gun to their head to join Belt and Road or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which, of course, where India is the second largest shareholder and the largest recipient of loans. No one has a gun to their head to do these things. It's because they were abandoned by everyone else. So I give China credit for this one thing, because, and it's something that we should be able to relate to in India, is that the majority of the world is post-colonial countries. Our infrastructure is crap. Absolute crap. And our populations have tripled since independence, right? Like India, like Pakistan, like Ethiopia. And no one, not the World Bank, abandoned doing infrastructure finance in the 50s and 60s because it's a dirty, corrupt business, right? So someone had to come in and do it. And what China did is just kick off this infrastructure arms race. And now, like I said, everyone's getting in on it because they see China doing it. And therefore, they're going to try and compete with China. And guess who the winners are? The winner is Kazakhstan. The winner is Thailand. The winner is Indonesia, because now everyone wants to put money in there because the Chinese are there. And that's how this modernization process is going to unfold. So overall, it's not a bilateral thing anymore between China and country X, Y, and Z. Everyone's involved, and the smart countries are the ones that, again, play all sides, multi-align, and ride that interest up to grow and to pay down those debts. That's genuinely, you don't have to be a naive optimist to think that that's what is going to happen in the smart countries. The dumb countries are going to fail, and they're going to become wholly owned subsidiaries of China. But no, that's not going to happen to any large or important country. Not a single one. Because quite frankly, these are my clients, so I know, right? That's why I work with the governments of Kazakhstan and Mongolia and others. I work with them closely all the time because they've already, for the last 10, 15 years, they've been working on these strategies to make sure that China doesn't own them, and they're succeeding.
Great. Listen, I think we're running out of time, but I have one last question coming in from Rudra in Delhi, and it's part opinion, as it normally is when it's coming from him, and part question. So, it picks up on two themes: the sphere of influence that you spoke about, and I think it's more of his opinion that is perhaps outdated in the context of modern geopolitics and NAFTA and NATO over the last sort of, U.S. out sort of post of the sphere. And they were largely economic and common enemy oriented, for lack of a better word. But the question is, going by this, should India be in the U.S. sphere of influence, give them a base in Kashmir, ask them to sort out the problem, and give them a fee?
That's hilarious. My first answer is that's hilarious. The second answer again is to quote already what the foreign minister said: we're choosing ourselves, choosing our own side, right? And again, that's the way it's going to be. That's what smart countries do. The set of countries, if you think about the American spheres of influence historically, and to the extent they still persist today, it's really just a few specific anchor alliances, most particularly Japan and Australia. Those countries are going to remain stalwart American allies, notwithstanding the enormous tensions and frictions actually between them. The Japanese are actually paying America to move troops from Okinawa to the island of Guam. And meanwhile, the Americans are moving troops and aircraft from Guam back to America because China can bomb Guam, anytime it wants to. So there's a lot of friction even in the strongest alliances that the U.S. has. The countries that are the quote-unquote eternal American allies are actually the small, vulnerable, geographical countries like the Gulf states, right? If you think about Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, those countries are always going to be American allies, and Israel, obviously, because they're always going to be vulnerable to Iran, for example, or Saudi Arabia. Territories like Kurdistan, obviously, right? Which, of course, sadly, the U.S. has kind of, sent down the river. But, the Kurds, the Mongolians, so it's these types of countries that are always going to welcome America. Oh, of course, the Baltic countries, right? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, much larger. So these are the countries where you have 100% support for a permanent American presence because they will never be able to defeat their much larger and hostile neighbors. So that, India does not belong in that category, obviously, right? India but again, what India is doing wisely is saying, we're happy to buy your most advanced military hardware and to have pushed very, very hard for joint production so that the jobs are created in India, the technology resides to some degree in India. India will have the long-term capacity to reproduce these technologies, obviously independently manage and operate it. Again, playing it hardball, right? Getting, if the U.S. wants to sell weapons to India, is tripping over itself to do so, as we know it is. Make them do it on Indian terms. And again, the Indian government has been smart about this hardball around joint production and so forth for a long time, and it's paid off, right? Again, we've done the same thing actually to Apple, right? For how many years has Apple said, we really want to have a full retail presence in India? And India always said, nope, not until you procure and do some of your assembly and manufacturing in India. And finally, India got its way. So when you're a large country and a large market and you're strategically positioned, you have leverage over great powers that other countries don't. So I think that the wise course of action is to always ruthlessly exercise that leverage as much as possible. So I think there's a lot of things we might criticize rightly about Indian politics and decision making domestically or internationally, but in some of these broad areas like the 360 diplomacy we were talking about, again, some of it is talk, some of it is action. But in terms of an overall philosophical thrust for what India needs to be doing diplomatically and strategically, there is every reason for India to continue down in those directions.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Parag. Thanks, Jyoti. Obviously, this is a conversation or a topic that we're only scratching the surface on. But once again, appreciate you taking the time, and we look forward to maybe doing a part 2 of this in a couple of months down the line. But thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.